Oh, yes. You are now listening to Darker Than Blue on WPFW 89.3 FM in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Sean Blackmon, here with Jacquie Luqman.
Hey.
And as always, we are your number one guide for struggle, socialism, and soul. It is Friday, April 5th, 2024. We are here on Darker Than Blue on WPFW Pacifica Radio, Jazz and Justice here in D.C. Jacquie, how you feeling?
I'm feeling pretty good. Thank God it's Friday. It's been a week.
That's a fact. That's a fact. We got some great conversations coming up here on the show today. And we actually wanted to begin by talking about the struggle for LGBTQ liberation here in the U.S., how this factors into the both sides politics of the U.S. ruling class, as we're, of course, in an election here in the U.S. and much more. And we're happy to be joined for this conversation by DC-based journalist and activist Morgan Aryukina. Morgan, thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Good to see you
Absolutely.
again.
Thank you. Good to see you too.
For sure. And Morgan, you recently published an article on Liberation News entitled "Trans People Need a Real Fightback Campaign Against Democrats' Anti-Working Class Policies." And I think this is important because it seems to me that the trans community and LGBTQ folks, and really any oppressed or exploited group in the U.S. that we can name, seem to all be under the same sort of pressure campaign from the Democrats and the Biden regime to vote for them in the 2024 election. Not only without having offered very much, in the way of, actually trying to address conditions, but even actively working against the interest of trans people, as you lay out in this article. So help us understand about these policies from the Democrats and the connection between trans liberation and the need for working class politics.
Yeah, well, the Democrats, they kind of posture, right, as like, we're the party that is the defender of the rights of minorities, whichever one, and that's kind of like the way that they play their kind of demographic game with gathering the votes, to win each election. And so this article is really just kind of addressing this kind of some of these tactics that are used to like do what we call like sheepdogging, right? Like kind of like herding people back in who might be being disillusioned or questioning, if they should support the Democrats or whatever, and saying, well, you need to vote for us because we're the only ones who can defend your rights. And, Trump is gonna, if Trump or whoever, Nikki Haley, I don't know, like gets into office, it's gonna be fascism, and we're gonna and it's gonna be it's the most important election of our lifetime, and so you need to kind of like just kind of suck it up and hold your breath and just kind of vote, right? And so this article is kind of taking apart some of the specific ways that they do that. For LGBTQ people and trans people, especially with this fear mongering around like, if you don't vote for us, there's going to be a genocide of trans people, and like they're going to do this, that, and the other thing on a national level that we've been standing by and, watching them do at the state level for several years now. And like, it's like no doubt that the Republicans really have it out for trans people. Like they've kind of made that clear. Like that's not really what's in contention. It's really more about like, are the Democrats going to be the ones to stop it? And can we trust them? Can we trust Biden especially? But really any Democrat at the national like level, because there have been some Democrats at the state level who have done some things here and there. And I don't want to like discount the fact that they have done that. But like on the national level, this kind of claim, especially for Biden, that like, that to be the reliable defender of trans rights. And so I talk about a couple of different things in the piece. On the one hand, confronting all the attacks that Biden has spearheaded against other parts of the working class. So sorry, a bunch of sun coming into my room right now all of a sudden. You know, so like even if it's true that he's going to defend the rights of trans people, like at what cost would that come? Like he's, you know, wide-ranging attacks against Black people, against immigrants. We've seen with this border policy that he's now literally uniting with Trump over after running against Trump. Like that alone, the fact that he's had that dramatic a reversal should call into doubt any pledge that he has to do something different from Trump. You know, we've also seen, you know, early in Biden's administration, he kind of postured against Naftali Bennett's government in Israel about like he was going to like stop the settlements in the West Bank and he was going to do whatever. And then now he's full on sponsoring, enabling, supporting this genocide in Gaza. And so, you know, to say nothing of the cuts to WIC, the cuts to SNAP, you know, the doubling of child poverty, the end of the child tax credit. Like these are wide-ranging attacks against wide parts of the working class, including trans and LGBTQ people. So it's like, whose safety would you really be guaranteeing if you voted for Biden, right? And it was, you know, so it's really kind of a very small number of people that it would really actually be benefiting, white affluent people, you know. And so that's kind of one half of it, but the other half is the fact that they have, as you said, you know, they've really not really been friends to LGBTQ people that much anyway. Made a bunch of big promises, didn't follow through on them because they don't have the guts to do it, to challenge the filibuster, to pass the Equality Act, pass the Women's Health Protection Act, the PRO Act, you know, all this stuff that they said they would do and then just didn't do. And then, as I note, you know, you even have this this case of Title IX where he's completely 180'd and is now interpreting Title IX as something that will allow discrimination against trans athletes, which he previously said that he wouldn't do. You know, so when that happened, you know, a bunch of state level lawmakers, Democrats, many trans people who've been fighting this stuff, you know, tooth and nail, like they came out and they were like, this, you're giving our enemies a roadmap to discriminate against us, you know, like with friends like these, who needs enemies?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And you know what, Morgan, people very often get confused about the issue of trans rights in the context of fighting for the entire working class. And, you know, people will often say, well, look, if we all get policies that'll help the working class, then everybody in the working class will benefit. Why do we need to focus on the rights of specific groups of people in the working class? Particularly now, as we're facing another, like you pointed out, you know, the most important election of our time. And there's all this talk of harm reduction and all this kind of stuff. But why is it important for us to raise these issues as they impact trans people, particularly as a part of the working class, and not just like, you know, some separate group of people that we're asking, hey, think about us too, please? How does this, the issue of trans rights fit into the context of working class rights for people who are also fighting for working class rights to understand that they have to include everyone in that fight?
Yeah, I think the people who say that really kind of they have the shoe on the wrong foot. You know, like it's true. Trans people are part of the working class, you know, and you know, much larger part of the working class kind of proportionally, as opposed to like their cisgender counterparts, you know, face higher rates of poverty and homelessness and, you know, instability and low wages and things like that. You know, I think trans women make like on average 60% of the wages of their male cisgender counterparts, you know, like to give just kind of one number. So and triple the overall poverty rate. So like it's true that fighting for the rights of trans people are closely interconnected with the rights of everybody else too. Like universal health care would benefit us too. That's absolutely a thing that we need, you know, protection from discrimination, whatever. The problem is that our enemies, the far right, the capitalists, the fascists, they use these divisions to turn the working class against itself, to get people fighting so that they're not uniting. You know, long before the Democrats were the ones who were being depended upon for, you know, LGBTQ rights protections, it was labor unions that were the first ones to really guarantee protection from discrimination, to guarantee, you know, health insurance coverage for same gender partners, things like that, you know. This was in like the 50s, 60s, 70s. You had workers who were otherwise probably pretty homophobic, uniting with their gay and lesbian and transgender coworkers because they realize that an injury to one is an injury to all.
Mm-hmm.
And that if your boss can deny that queer person health care, can allow that queer person to be discriminated against in hiring, in whatever else, they can do it to you too. And so the workers have to stand together and protect everybody, or everybody's at risk. And that's really true across the working class writ large too. So long as they are allowed to pick out minority groups and convince people that those people are your enemy, whether it's trans people, whether it's Jews, whether it's Black people, whether it's women, whatever, and say that person's rights and interests are antagonistic to yours and get you fighting them, that's denying a unity between all of these people that we could use to then fight our bosses, to fight the ruling class, for things that will benefit all of us, those things that those people who, say those kinds of things are rightly sensing that we have this kind of shared, destiny in the end. So that's what I would say to them.
Yeah, Morgan, someone may hear our conversation and might even agree with some aspects of what we've been discussing, but they may ask the question, well, what then is the alternative? If we're not going to vote for Biden, if we're not going to support the Democrats who, pretend to be the champions of oppressed and exploited people, but as you know in your piece, are really just fair weather friends at absolute best, what then is a real alternative outside of the sort of hamster wheel of the ruling class duopoly?
Yeah, I mean, I think the key thing when it comes down to it all is the fact that the Republicans and the Democrats are both ruling class capitalist parties. Their politicians are bought and paid for by the capitalist ruling class, and they then serve those interests, and those aren't our interests as working people, as oppressed people. And so, and I would extend that to other parties like the libertarians and stuff too. They're all pro-capitalist. Like that's what it comes down to, and capitalism isn't pro-worker, so we need a party that is of the working class, that is of working people, answers to working people, and is accountable to that. And I mean, there are candidates on the ballot, people like Claudia de la Cruz, who's running for the Party for Socialism and Liberation, is I mean, she's a working class woman from the Bronx. She's not Joe Biden has how many mansions and offices and stuff that they've been turning up all of these files in. He forgets about it, whatever. Like it's like I wish I had that many houses to just forget about,
Yeah.
secret documents or whatever. But like it's we need a party of working people. We have a party of working people. It's just we need to support that party and that organization, and a campaign that is really accountable to working people, that doesn't get its money from these billionaire super PACs, who that's an investment for them. When you get these wealthy people, they put money into it, they expect to get something back, but like a working class campaign is a campaign that can really be a fighting campaign, that is going to fight for working people and oppressed people, because if we don't fight for ourselves, there's nobody to fight for us, and so yeah, that's the key.
Yeah, it definitely is. And I too wish I had a mansion or two so I could put all of my problems in one mansion and forget about it and never remember that I have to pay those bills or whatever it is. But we're working class people. We don't pay our bills. We get kicked out of our stuff. We cannot get another loan from another bank, with bad credit. We don't have that kind of luxury. And that's why we have to fight together on our shared experiences in this capitalist system, our shared understanding of how it oppresses us all. And Morgan, when we are facing this, particularly this election issue, and how do you see us moving this working class movement further ahead, advancing it, particularly in a time when not just working class voices are being silenced in general for opposing capitalism, but people who are realizing that they have a conscience and they're standing up against things like genocide. They're standing up against the failures of this government to provide for working class people, then you've got a separate level of repression. How difficult has it been, and do you think it's going to be, to get this message out to people, to the many millions of people who need to hear it, to understand that this is their movement too? How do we face this repression that's making it difficult for this message to get out, to grow this movement?
Yeah, I mean, I think independent media, is a big part of that. And not being relying again, it comes down to class, who owns the big corporate media
Mhm.
outlets. It's the same billionaires who are putting these money into these super PACs to
Right.
be able to buy these politicians to do their bidding, it's the reason they call the media, the fourth estate, right? Like
Right.
it's kind of another wing of the capitalist state there. So I think it's important to support, independent media, and to be having these conversation ourselves in our communities and among ourselves, and to really be kind of putting ourselves out there, to get involved in your local labor unions and your tennis unions, and show up to that protest on Saturday, and do a lot more than just kind of like post your support on social media and argue with people online. Like it's much more substantial to like be there in person, and to show up and actually like get some skin in the game and have real conversations with real people, like that's kind of how we start to move that needle. But yeah, definitely I want to say, yeah, independent media, like we have to have our own media organs again, like that are accountable to the working class and accountable to working and oppressed people, that will give a voice to Black working class voices, to trans voices, to Palestinian voices, and everybody else that is that you can pick up any given issue of the New York Times and find maligned.
Mm.
Yeah, for sure. And what you're saying is so important, Morgan, because it points us toward the direction of developing a mass movement. You know what I mean? And I think in a moment like this, where we're at politically in the US, it's really important to sort of hammer that home because, I mean, as we know, there's a deep level of individualism that's just kind of part and parcel of capitalist culture. But also, when we're in a time when there's so many contradictions and people's conditions are worsening and things like this, it can disincline people away from collective struggle and collective action because we're in a mindset of just sort of being worried about like our own personal situation. But historically, as we know, any bit of progress that has been achieved or accomplished by our class has always come about as a part of a mass struggle, particularly among working people and certainly among trans and LGBTQ folks in general. We've seen that to be the case as well. And so it seems that the key to this, when we talk about whether it's, alternative media or like a grassroots fight back against these anti-working policies, it seems that really building the movement, Morgan, is sort of where we should be focused.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, absolutely. That is, like you said, we have this very hyper individualized society on the one hand, and on the other hand, I think there's kind of an attitude of like, well, what can I do about it? It's this sucks, that sucks, and I just have to kind of like, just kind of, take it like a soldier. And we don't have to do that. We can fight back, we can win, and we only do that when it's through the strength of our collectivity. Like we don't have the armies, we don't have the police, we don't have billions of dollars, but we do have ourselves. We have numbers, and we have determination. We have everything is at stake for us. Like you said, like it's we're being pushed into greater and greater precarity. They're isolating this group and that group, and I mean, I think the lesson that we see in Gaza right now, is just the fact that like they will just do the worst thing you can think of that they could ever do. They'll do it, and every organ of power they have will help and enable and make excuses for it. And so we can kind of sit here individually and just kind of, wait for it to come, or we can do something about it. And that's really what it takes is people have to come together and get involved and put some skin in the game, and, swallow their pride and put their shoulder to the wheel, and lots of other buzzwords.
Right. All right. Well, we thank you so much, Morgan, for joining us today. And, Jacquie, I think what we were discussing here with Morgan is so important because it just reminds us of all of the different sort of things that are at stake sort of in the United States right now at a time when capitalism is on decline and imperialism is on decline as well. I mean, earlier today, I was able to attend a rally that was calling for the end of the Korean War. I mean, I think a lot of Americans don't know that the Korean War is still technically going on. And of course, this, along with the trans struggle, the LGBTQ struggle, the Palestinian struggle, the Black liberation struggle, they all have implications and are all connected in the sense that they all emanate from the capitalist system itself. And particularly when we talk about the issue of anti-imperialism and the sort of Black nationalist tradition that we know to have such a strong current. And I believe that, we can talk about that a little later, especially as it pertains to Vietnam. But we want to move now to some tech news. And we are very happy to be joined by our friend Chris Garaffa, a technologist and co-host of the Covert Action Bulletin podcast. Chris, thanks so much for joining.
Yeah, it's so great to be on the show with you. Thanks for having me.
Glad to have you. Again,
Absolutely.
Back.
Oh, yeah. Great to have you back, Chris. And, here recently, the U.S. has actually bailed out Intel, which, of course, is a leading microchip manufacturer. And this bailout was to the tune of an $8.5 billion grant, in addition to up to $11 billion in tax credits and loans. Now, President Joe Biden actually announced the grant back on March 20th in Arizona as part of the $280 billion CHIPS Act. And, I'm no expert on these sorts of things, Chris. It doesn't seem to me that a company like Intel really needs a bailout. But I was hoping you could help us understand just what is happening here with Intel and what you see as the implications.
Sure. So Intel has certainly been having a few bad years. We'll just say it that financially, but this is still a multi-billion-dollar company. They, had a gross profit of over $27 billion last year. So even if they're having a bad year, that's still a pretty good year. If I say it, I mean, $27 billion. But their stock price has been falling. They have had some significant issues. Part of that was that so-called just the general kind of infrastructure issues we were having during COVID-19 with, getting parts, getting things shipped and all of that. But that doesn't account for all of it. But ultimately, yeah, we have the government giving them $8.5 billion grant. So that's just free. $11 billion in loans that they're going to have very favorable terms on for repayment, and then also tax credits. And they're going to use part of this to build a few new manufacturing plants. So they make the microchips that go into our cars, our phones, computers, certainly basically everything we have. So Intel is one of those companies. They're going to be building and upgrading some of their chip production plants. Now, one of them is going to be in Chandler, Arizona, which is where this announcement happened on March 20th. But you got to look at, what's the deal in Chandler, Arizona? So you have in Chandler, Arizona, I did some research into this. The average per capita income for the county, Maricopa County, it's only $41,000 a year. Whereas the CEO of Intel, Pat Gelsinger, actually made $11.6 million in 2022. So they're bailing out this CEO and this, the board of directors and the executives of this company, but very little is actually going to come down to Maricopa County or New Albany, Ohio. And I mentioned New Albany as one of the other areas because actually Intel was going to open up a new foundry in 2022 there. And then they all of a sudden, just weeks before that project was going to break ground, they said, you know what, we're going to hold on to this until the CHIPS Act passes. The CHIPS Act, of course, being that massive $280+ billion bailout for the chip manufacturing industry. They said, oh, we're just going to hold off on this. We're not going to do anything with this. Intel says they're going to create 30,000 jobs with this money. but actually only about 10,000 of those, a third, are going to be manufacturing jobs. The other 20,000 are going to be construction jobs. Now, people certainly need jobs, but when the construction is done, where do those workers go? What's the plan for those workers after that construction is done? So 2/3 of the jobs are effectively temporary jobs. But we have to see this in the context of the new Cold War. That's where we have to look at this. And that's exactly what the CHIPS Act was meant to do, was to further the new Cold War against China. Secretary of Commerce Gina Raimondo actually had a press call as Biden, or right after Biden was announcing these, the grants for Intel. And she said, I'm going to read this quote: "We rely on a very small number of factories in Asia for all of our most sophisticated chips. That's untenable and unacceptable. It's an economic security problem. It's a national security problem. And we're going to change that." And so again, that is the Secretary of Commerce basically saying that, the US has to contain China, limit China's access to technology, and they want to supposedly build, bring manufacturing to the US. What they say in the small print, though, by the way, is that they only want to have 20%. The goal is to have 20% of global chip production in the United States by 2030. Only 20%. So that's not going to contain China in any way. But this is part of that entire new Cold War, the containment strategy and the tech element of that, trying to remove China from the global playing field, as China has made significant advances in microchip fabrication, design, and development.
Yeah, Chris, and actually, hasn't China become like the world leader in microchip and semiconductor manufacturing? And I cannot remember the name of the Chinese company that is like the largest manufacturer of semiconductors and microchips in the world. I mean, so the United States, it seems to me, with this CHIPS Act, which is from what I understand, the legislation basically it's doing exactly what it's doing. It says it's going to do exactly what they're doing now, giving tax breaks to American companies that make semiconductors and chips and such, and encouraging more manufacturing, all that kind of stuff. But isn't it basically a waste of money, a losing effort? Because isn't China already the leading manufacturer of semiconductors and microchips in the world?
Yeah, seeing this coming a number of years ago, the Chinese government turned around and they said, listen, this is, we need to do something. And they invested a significant amount of money in chip manufacturing. I think the company you might be thinking about is SMIC, Semiconductor
Yes.
Manufacturing International Corporation. They are a Chinese company. And Huawei also makes their own chips. Huawei, of course, most popular and most famous for phones that you can get pretty much everywhere except the United States, because the US government has, in fact, banned Huawei products, along with ZTE, Hikvision, and a number of other Chinese companies as part of, and this, by the way, goes back to the Trump administration and continued by the Biden administration. This is a bipartisan effort to remove China and from U.S. infrastructure to prevent us from buying Chinese technology, and also to contain China and to limit its economic power. It doesn't matter Republican or Democrat. They're both all about that, and it doesn't benefit us in any way. Containing China, saying that we can't buy Chinese phones or use Chinese 5G equipment or any of that kind of stuff, does not benefit you or I in any way. It only benefits like Ericsson and Sony and Nokia and these other companies who want to make this, and who fell behind Chinese companies. Mm-hmm. They fell behind in the 2010s in terms of, especially around 5G, and now they're basically saying, hey, we need to be bailed out. We need to be protected.
Definitely. And switching gears a little bit here, Chris, I also wanted to touch on a recent piece that was published in Plus 972 magazine. It was talking about the artificial intelligence machine that is helping to direct Israel's bombing in Gaza. This machine by the name of Lavender. And reportedly, this is a targeting system that operates with little human oversight. And so I was hoping you could help us understand this technology. I mean, we know that Israel does possess a lot of very sophisticated military technology and things like this. But what exactly is Lavender, and how does it factor into this ongoing genocide against Gaza?
Lavender is effectively an AI system, from what we know, that will pick the targets that the IDF will then bomb. And it will pick those targets. It'll give them a few seconds to approve or not, reject the suggestions. And then the call goes out and they go and the bombs fly. The article in 972 magazine, it is chilling to read. It's a very long article. I recommend people read it. There's been a lot of discussion about it recently. And it shows how far the IDF is actually going to kill civilians. They explicitly say in interviews here with unnamed people from the various parts of the IDF, they say, yeah, we're basically killing entire families. We bombed him and his house. In the end, you're killing a whole family. They have a few steps in this process. I mean, they lay it out really well in this article where Lavender goes through and creates the kill list. They team it up with another software program called, this is awful, Where's Daddy, to try to identify the house that people are living in based on the facial recognition systems that are used in Lavender. They decide whether or not the person is male or female because they think that there's only, men in Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad, whatever. And then they say, okay, that was a man living in this house. How many civilians are in the house? Oh, effectively, they've said internally that one Hamas operative is worth 10 civilians. So they can justify the killing of 10 civilians if they think they're targeting one member of Hamas. The entire thing is, it's warfare on speed because this happens in a matter of minutes or seconds because they're using AI technology, they're using facial recognition, including reportedly facial recognition from Google Photos, which is against the terms of service of Google Photos. And I think there should be a call for Google to shut off the IDF's access to Google Photos entirely for that. But I think the bigger point here is that the IDF is one of the leading forces around the world in this deadly cyber weaponry, in using AI and using technology for surveillance and for warfare. The Unit 8200 is one of the most notorious units in the IDF. And that's where a lot of that tech comes from. And then when people leave their active service in the IDF, many of the members of Unit 8200 go on to create companies like the NSO Group or Elbit Systems and others. Now, I know we have talked about these, I've talked about with both of y'all about these companies. NSO Group creates that Pegasus spyware that can infect your phone without you ever even knowing it. Elbit Systems makes weapons for the IDF, and then there's a number of companies under this same, these same milieus that they, that come out of Unit 8200, and this is, they're known the world around for this kind of technology.
And Chris, the interesting thing, other than just the fact that this kind of thing exists and is being used by Israel against Palestinians, but another interesting aspect of this software, this company Lavender, was when it was allegedly produced. Where did this thing come from? When was it produced?
So Lavender, there's an interesting history to Lavender, and it's actually not entirely clear. There are a number of different stories out there, including the one in 972, but there are a few other stories about the history of Lavender and where it comes from, and what it originated as. So without trying to say too much which one I believe, I think what we can say is that this entire history of Lavender, of Where's Daddy, of all of these similar tools actually comes from the need of the IDF to use all of the tools at its disposal and to spend billions and untold billions of dollars on developing these kinds of tools. Similar to how the CIA, had Vault 7 and they have their hacking tools and they have their own AI systems. The depravity really of the IDF goes as far and further, certainly, than as developing these kinds of tools and partnering with private companies. And that's important to mention, right? They do partner with these private companies inside and outside of Israel to develop these sorts of weapons. We should stop calling them tools, really. We should call them weapons, because that's what they are.
They are weapons for sure. And I feel like this is important to discuss, Chris, because it gives yet another sort of example of how things like artificial intelligence can be weaponized in this context. It can be weaponized in service not just to the Zionist state of Israel specifically, but to U.S. imperialism in general. And I mean, I feel like we could extrapolate that just to talk about how technology is used by and large to facilitate war. And even with a lot of the pre-existing issues of AI that we discussed before, in terms of racial bias and things like that, I mean, combined with a fundamentally racist U.S. war machine that's operating around the globe, makes for a very dangerous situation. And I think the fact that not only is it important that we sort of talk about how technology helps facilitate war, but when we talk about Israel specifically, we're discussing how this technology is being used to basically help support this outpost of U.S. imperialism in the Middle East region that we call Israel. You know what I mean? And so it's sort of a layered way of sort of thinking about it. But particularly when we talk about organizing and fighting back against this, I think it's important to understand because it shows us how deep it goes, and it shows us how complex, if you will, this struggle against imperialism is.
And not only is it used exactly in the way you say, but it comes right back to the U.S. too. I mean, think about all the police departments who go to Israel to be trained. They get trained on crowd control, they get trained on technology, they get trained on these kinds of weapons. And in fact, then the companies come back and they say, "Hey, we want to sell these technologies to the U.S. in the United States." And so, for example, you have surveillance companies selling stuff to the U.S. government in Texas and Arizona, and they say proudly, "Yeah, we tested this in Palestine. We tested these detection systems in Palestine, where it detects, is what's crossing this area larger than a rabbit, for example. Detects changes in the air. It detects footsteps, all of that." And they proudly say, "We've tested this in Palestine." What they mean is we've tested this against Palestinians, not
Right.
in Palestine. They've tested it against Palestinians. And so we should, if for no other reason than realizing that this is coming back to us, also be concerned about this. It should not be used against Palestinians, and we certainly don't want it used anywhere else in the world. So as people are looking at these tools, at these weapons, at these systems, these applications of artificial intelligence and facial recognition and saying, "Yeah, I don't want that to be used there. We also don't want it to be used here either." But unfortunately, Israel is often the way that a lot of these really awful technologies do get tested before they are exported around the rest of the world. It's another way that U.S.-Israel relationship works, where the U.S. has Israel do that testing and in many cases the development of these technologies. And they say, "Great, we got it down. We tested it on Palestinians. It works. Now you can use it on a Black Lives Matter protest. Now you can use it on indigenous nations. Now you can use it on people trying to cross the border because their lives depend on crossing the border." That's really what this comes down to.
Yeah, Chris, and what is?
Absolutely.
Oh, I'm sorry. Just
No, go
one
ahead,
last. Yeah, one last question, Chris. What does the exposure of these kinds of softwares, these companies, this kind of technology being used by Israel against Palestinians? What does the exposure of this kind of stuff do to this narrative that has always been coming out of Israel? Oh, we have a right to protect ourselves, but particularly now. What does the revelation of this software and what it's been used for do to the narrative that Israel is just responding to what Hamas did on October 7th? I feel like this software just kind of destroys that, that Hamas wants to kill us all kind of thing, because we know that's not true. But I think this software being used says something else really awful.
I mean, this and everything we have seen in the last 6 months really blows that entirely out of the water. There is no way that you can really reasonably use that as an excuse to defend Israel in any way and be taken seriously at this point on the world stage. They have been developing this software and others like it for years. They've been developing spy technologies for decades. They've been, perfecting these weapon systems for decades, the techniques of oppression for decades. This is not something that started 6 months ago. This is something that started decades ago. And so Israel is really showing its hand here and saying, hey, we've been waiting for the moment to use this. And in fact, they have been using it, and they've been using it since before October in one form or another. How it gets deployed changes. But this is not something that they, up on October 8th, said, oh, let's go get a bunch of coders in a room and write this. They didn't do that. They had this ready to go, pretty much, set to go. Let's get it out there. Let's use it. There is nothing new about this, and trying to use that as an excuse just shows, again, the depravity, the lawlessness of the Israeli state and system.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Well, we thank you so much, Chris, for joining us today. And, Jacquie, I'm really glad that Chris was making these different connections between tech and the genocide on Palestine and the U.S. support for it, because I was mentioning a little earlier how I was at this demonstration calling for an end to the Korean War because there never was a peace treaty. And the U.S., of course, arbitrarily just sort of divided the Korean peninsula between North and South so that it could control one part of it. But at the demonstration, there were people that were wearing keffiyehs and were chanting and making, direct connections between the struggle to decolonize the Korean peninsula and the struggle for Palestinian liberation. Now, of course, both these places have in common that process of colonization and this deep interference by U.S. imperialism. I mean, people may be aware that in South Korea, there's a movement against the militarization of the country and basically the U.S. control of the country and the implementation of things like the THAAD missile defense system. Also, there's a pretty strong labor union movement in South Korea that fights against these sorts of things as well. And then the fact that, today is April 5th, and yesterday was the 57th anniversary of Martin Luther King's statement against the war in Vietnam. And that's a common thread as well, because now we're talking about the Black liberation struggle and its contribution to anti-imperialism and internationalism. And I would argue that our struggle in this country has been international. I mean, stretching back to the period of enslavement. I mean, if
absolutely.
We think of, just to give one example, like the uprising that was led by Denmark Vesey in South Carolina. I mean, some historians say that Vesey was in contact with Jean-Pierre Boyer, who was then the president of Haiti, with Boyer saying that, there was land available in Haiti for any Black Americans, basically, that wanted to leave the U.S. And so you fast forward to 1967, and King comes out with this statement at a time when his politics are radicalizing. And he makes this explicit connection between the U.S. war machine, between U.S. imperialism, and the war at Vietnam. King made it clear and understood that white supremacy here at home, quote unquote, resounds and resonates with imperialist war abroad. And he talked about all the money. I think the statistic he quoted would say during that time, something like $5,000 was spent to kill each so-called enemy combatant, but only $53 were going to support someone that was classified as poor. And he talked about how the bombs that drop in Vietnam explode in the ghettos of the United States. And one of my favorite comments from Dr. King about Vietnam is when he talked about how he was, just going through the different cities and the ghettos of the urban North that were going through all these uprisings and these struggles against racist terror and discrimination and everything else. And he would talk to the young people and he wanted to be sympathetic with them. But of course, King, he was preaching the gospel of nonviolence. And King said, but the young people said, and rightfully so, well, what about Vietnam? And so King saw the contradiction of a country that would praise him for telling Black people to be nonviolent in the South against racist sheriffs, but that same government will condemn him for telling the U.S. government to be nonviolent against the people in Vietnam. And King really paid a price for this. His popularity took a serious hit. People basically said that he needed to stay in his own lane. He didn't need to worry about foreign policy or international issues. He just needed to focus on domestic race issues and things like that. And it was something that was controversial during that time. I also want to remind people that the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, in its historic support for Palestine in 1967, also sided with Palestine in the Arab-Israeli War. And so, again, this Black anti-war, Black internationalist, and even a Black pro-Palestine tradition, because we are talking about something that stretches back to at least the early to mid 60s. And so there's a reason why we consistently see Black people in the United States, descendants of formerly enslaved Africans here in the US, and how throughout history we're making connections with struggling people elsewhere in the diaspora and around the whole earth. I mean, we can get into a whole thing about the petition of We Charge Genocide that was presented by Paul Robeson and William L. Patterson, where they talked about racism in war, where they specifically criticized Washington's colonial relationship with Puerto Rico. And so this is important, Jacquie, not only because of the worsening conditions and the intensifying propaganda, but also because of the tendency among certain segments of Black America to have this sort of xenophobic, nativist type of politic that is presented as something that will help Black people get reparations or take a step towards Black liberation. But the complete opposite is true. And I mean, I could ramble on and on and on here, but I really would like to hear your thoughts about all that, Jeff.
No, I mean, you're absolutely right. The timing we are in is pretty important, but it's also, I know for a lot of people it's really jarring, but those of us who are engaged in organized struggle, we have to rely on knowing this history of struggle to inform us to how we do what we do, because see, we've been here before. This is a thing I don't think people quite understand. And when you read the words of someone like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who we've been kind of indoctrinated to believe was very liberal and all he cared about was peace and being meek and all of that kind of stuff. And we are only taught about his I Have a Dream speech, but not even the whole speech, just that part where he says, I have a dream. Because if you read the entire speech, you will see that Dr. King was actually talking about the nightmare of us living in this country because of what he laid out more clearly in his speech against Vietnam. And that is the militarism, the racism, and the materialism in this country that we are suffering under. It is crushing us, and it was crushing us then, and he laid it out so eloquently and beautifully in the speech in Riverside Church, where he talked about beyond Vietnam, like, what are we going to do after this mess ends, this mess where we see this government spending more money, a government in the richest country that the planet may have ever seen, spending more money on war than it is on the poor. And that was back in 1960. What year was that? 8, Sean? So we've been in this place before where we have seen and exposed and done our job, what we're supposed to do, to condemn this government for the mismanagement, number one, of our tax dollars, and number two, for not showing any kind of moral, any kind of existence of any type of morality in wholesale murdering scores of people, thousands of people around the world in the name of capitalist expansion in foreign countries, which is imperialism, and neo-colonial control, imperialist control of foreign markets and exploitation of working class and poor people around the world. King was pointing this out in 68. Others pointed it out long before then. What do we think W.E.B. Du Bois was talking about when he wrote about voting in 1958, when he said, I won't vote, because both of these parties are terrible. Both of the parties do not meet the needs of our people, working class and poor Black people and other working class and poor people. They deny entry into politics of third parties. They don't listen to the people. That was in 1958 when W.E.B. Du Bois wrote that. And here we are in 2024 having the same conversations about both political parties. So we radicals, we Black radicals, especially those of us who are organizing because we are informed and inspired really by the Black radical tradition. We understand we've been here before. We understand that we won a lot of these battles and we have a blueprint in this history. And that's why the Black Alliance for Peace was actually formed on April 4th in 2017, because we recognize that this Black radical organizing, agitating, political education tradition had waned, and we needed to pick it back up in order to do our part in building this mass people's movement that we all need to defeat this system and build a socialist system for all of us, for not just a better life for us here in the United States, but honestly, and this is not an exaggeration, but honestly for peace in the world. Because capitalism requires exploitation and the pursuit and domination of foreign markets when the original market can't grow anymore. So capitalism is at the root, and imperialism at the root of a lot of conflict and war that goes up, the militarism that Dr. King was talking about. So our ancestors who came before us in this Black radical tradition, they gave us the blueprint, they gave us who we should be focused on, and they told us how to organize. All we have to do is to continue to do it, Sean. So that's why we do what we do. And you're absolutely right. This moment in time is not just historical, but it's the perfect moment for us to seize our role in this fight against this system for all of our freedom.
Yeah, definitely. And one thing that I meant to mention when speaking about King, he gave that speech about Vietnam on April 4th in 67.
Mm-hmm.
A year to the day later, he would be assassinated.
Right.
And, King's life had been under threat, numerous times in his political career because of his role fighting for Black liberation, being a leader in that. But I just think it's noteworthy that when King came out explicitly against U.S. imperialism, and he began talking about the triple evils of racism, economic exploitation, and war, I think at that point he reached a new level of danger from the standpoint of the U.S. state.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's one thing to try to really shift. Basically, it's one thing to try to end American apartheid. I think the U.S. At that juncture was willing to concede that if it meant sort of the whole country staying intact. We know that at different points in history, the ruling class makes concessions because they know if they don't, they may have an all-out revolutionary crisis on their hands. But when Martin, with all of his moral legitimacy and all of his prominence and his stature, excuse me, both inside the U.S. and outside of it, when he started having that international analysis in that appeal, I think he became especially dangerous. You see, because it's easy, I think, to demonize someone like Malcolm X or an organization like the Black Panthers, because, all the state has to do is point at them and say, well, look at these crazy Negroes. They just want to pick up guns and kill everybody. Even though that's not true, that's a narrative that can be easily manipulated. But you can't really put that sort of thing on Dr. King, who just obviously saw things differently, tactically and ideologically.
Mm-hmm.
So someone like a Martin King specifically, like that specific person and what he stood for, I think posed a unique sort of threat to the U.S. state and to imperialism. And so it's very clear that a decision was made that King had to go. And I feel like this is a big part of what is often missing when we talk about King and when we talk about sort of the history of the anti-war struggle in the U.S. in general. And the fact that King was killed under these circumstances. And I feel like I should also point out that in a more direct sense, we know that King was killed while in Memphis, Tennessee, supporting a labor struggle of the garbage men. So King literally died while in the process of a class struggle, having already made the connections between the class, race, and imperialist struggle. And I should also mention that, you know, in that latter part of King's life, he was very openly critical of capitalism itself. And he would ask questions in his speeches like, well, who owns the iron ore? You know, one of my favorite, he said, you know, why do we have to pay a water bill on a planet that's mostly water? And, you know, he literally said we have to begin to question the capitalistic economy. And so this is a much more sort of thorough and nuanced understanding of King and his politics than we hear about him. But I think it's very instructive in this moment, particularly as the movement sort of writ large is asking itself a number of questions about which way to go on Palestine, which way to go on, you know, how do we grapple with, you know, the upcoming election and how do we engage with that and all of these sorts of things. Excuse me. And while I'm glad that, speaking of Palestine, is actually going to be a People's Conference for Palestine in May of 24th to 26th in Detroit, Michigan. And so these histories, I mean, we could even, excuse me, we could even talk about the Black Panthers and their support for, you know, the revolutionary movement in the DPRK in North Korea and how, you know, they would go and meet with their leadership and how the Panthers supported and was in communication, in some cases met the revolutionary and progressive movements and governments all over what they then called the Third World and what today we would call the Global South, whether it was Korea, Vietnam, China, Cuba, Palestine. You know what I mean? Certainly the different struggles in the African continent as well. I mean, we know they had an embassy in Algiers, Algeria, following that country's independence from France. And so there's just no, and it's funny, the more you talk about it, the clearer it is that there's just no getting around the, not only this history, but the international character of our struggle. So if what we're talking about is a liberation of Black people from capitalism, from white supremacy, understanding how that manifests on a global scale and about how that global system of imperialism is based on our oppression right here. It stretches back all the way to when we were literally in chains in this country. The wealth that we were forced to produce went on to not only set the groundwork for the United States, but it also set the wheels in motion for capitalism as a global economic force. And we know that imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism. But we could be here all day talking about this, Jackie, but that's going to do it for today and this week here on Darker Than Blue on a WPFW in Washington, D.C. Please stay tuned for news and views with Garland Nixon, and we will see you next time. Peace.
Peace, y'all. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for joining us today on Darker Than Blue. I'm not doing another show because I'm very tired. I have had a busy week, busier than I thought it was going to be. And yesterday was a little stressful. BAP went to an event at Howard University where they had invited the State Department to come and speak to students at Howard University to talk about the Global Fragility Act and how the State Department is supposedly helping to, what did they call it? Stamp out conflicts before they happen, and it was terrible. It was terrible. It was one of the most shameful things I have seen in a long time, and it was heartbreaking to see these students, graduate students who are actually from countries on the continent, praise the State Department and want the State Department to come with the Global Fragility Act and fix their countries and all the conflict they've been going on, that's been going on in their countries for decades. And here we are, just trying to see what is being said, because that's why we went. And it's clear. It is absolutely clear. It's one thing to say that the state has influence and control, and their agencies are on the campuses of HBCUs, indoctrinating our kids into being agents of the state, basically. It's one thing to know that that's happening. I got to tell y'all, it's another thing to see it and how it's done. And so that was, it was something that we needed to do as Black Alliance for Peace. We're going to release a statement. We're going to be working on it in that Mid-Atlantic this weekend, once I get back from my special trip tomorrow. And I'll tell you about the special trip in a minute. But we're going to be putting out a fact sheet or a statement or something about that particular event at Howard University that we witnessed and challenged. We did, and the response that we received was very interesting. So we're going to talk about that. We'll release some more information about that, I think, next week. There are a couple other things going on that are not public, so we can't talk about them yet, but we'll talk about them after we have done them, because, like I said, not public yet. And I just really need some time, not doing anything. Okay, but my special trip tomorrow is I am going to a dog adoption event out in Silver Spring, I think, where I'm going to take a look at a Rottweiler that I might be able to adopt. She's a little older. Her name is Sirius. If I adopt her, that shall not continue to be her name. But she's 7 years old. She's a little bit older. She's a little older than I like, because big dogs do not live. Most big dogs, their average lifespan is about 10, 11 years, maybe 12. Sometimes you need a little longer, but big dogs generally, they have like a decade lifespan, maybe a little bit longer. But I have wanted a Rottie all my life. But I've never, ever wanted to buy from a breeder, because I don't like that dogs are taken, or cats, or any animals. I don't like that they are taken from their mommies when they are born. I do not like that. But I also don't ever want to buy from a breeder. And these people on Facebook and whatnot that are advertising for dogs, no, they are very sketchy. So looked around, did my research, and these people have a Rottweiler rescue in somewhere out in rural Maryland. So they're coming out, bringing Sirius, because I expressed interest in her. So I'm going to meet her tomorrow, and I hope it goes well, because she looks like a sweet big baby. The way she's described as a sweet big baby, and I really just need some comfort in my life. So I'm going to look at hopefully what will be my new fur baby. And if she doesn't work out, then there are so many adorable, sweet, fantastic bullies, pit bulls and Staffordshire bull terriers and bull dogs and bull mixes at the New York Avenue shelter. So I don't know, maybe I'll have 2 dogs, because I said I was probably going to get 2 dogs this time. So tomorrow I'm doing this thing for me. I'm going to look at some fur babies, and I will probably have some new kids the next time you talk to me. But I am taking a break because I desperately need one. Lots of stuff going on, but we're going to deal with that next week. I hope you all have a really great weekend. I hope that I might even get a little bit of gardening in. I just might. If the weather is nice enough and it's warm enough and the ground is warm enough, I might do some cleaning up of my, and do that. So I'm doing stuff for me this weekend. I hope you do stuff for you this weekend. I hope you take very good care of yourself and you take very good care of others. And as always, a luta continua, the struggle continues. But if we continue to struggle, I promise, Victoria, Acerta, victory is certain. I'll talk to y'all later. Peace.